In the last video, we saw how to use arguments to provide input to our functions. Now we'll see how to return a value as output. So far, we've seen how to create basic named functions that take arguments and perform certain actions. In our case, we created a function called sayHello, which takes two arguments, name and greeting. And we've seen what happens if we call sayHello with both a name and a greeting, and also what happens if we just call it with name. In that case, greeting is undefined, and we used an if statement to set a default value for greeting. Now you can think of arguments as the input to a function, but there's also an output from a function call, and that's called the return value. We saw this a little bit earlier when we were in our console. If we go in our console and type sayHello, and we'll say the name is world, and we'll just leave the second argument empty, what happens? Well, we see a line where our console.log is called, but we also have this output arrow that says undefined. And in the console, this means this is the return value, or the value of the expression we previously called. In our case, sayHello, when we execute it, evaluated to undefined. And that's because we did not provide a return value. We can change what this is by simply using the keyword return. And let's see what that is. So what we can do is, after we've done all of our logic here, we'll use the return keyword, and then we pass it a value. So let's say we want to return the string done. That's easy enough. So what will happen if we call sayHello? Well, let's just try it in the console real quick. We have our two different calls that come from our script, but if we call sayHello one more time, we see our hello world call, but now instead of saying undefined is the expression value, it's the string done. And that's because we called return with that string. Now, not all functions that we write will have a return value that you want to return, in which case we could just call return. And let's see what happens if we don't pass it a value. If we refresh and we call sayHello again, now we get undefined. So essentially what we've done is just called return, which will return nothing or undefined. Now, since that's no different from us not calling return at all, this piece of code right here wouldn't make much sense. But we'll see how maybe a return call could be useful even if you're not returning something. So let's take a look at what would happen if we want to return a different value or a dynamic value. Now, really sayHello doesn't have a much meaningful value, but if we write a different function that maybe joins two strings together or performs some sort of other action that you may want to use somewhere else, a return value is a great thing to use. Right now, let's say we want to return the length of name. Because name will be a string, we can use the .length property, and that will return us the number of characters in our string. I'm going to change our execution code right here to console.log the values. Since sayHello will now return a value, we can actually use that value, and we'll just say console.log. I'll do the same here. So if we go back and we refresh, we'll see both times we get the return value 3. This first call right here is the console.log coming from inside of our sayHello function saying greetings world Jim. And the second console.log is the one from line 12 that's actually logging the return value of sayHello. Now let's just change these a little bit around so we don't get 3 for both of them. And change the first one to James. And now we can see that the return value is different. It's dependent on the name being passed in. Now, we'll see some other functions later and see how the return value can be used. There's one other thing to note about return that's really important and really useful. Any code that we have after a return call in a function will not be executed. Let's take a look at that. If we call return name.length and say console.log end of function, and we refresh, we'll see that the code doesn't change at all. Now, this isn't a very useful property right now, but what we can do is call return in a conditional statement. So right now, we've defined that greeting can be undefined, and we've handled it using if type of greeting is undefined, we'll set a value. However, I don't want name to be an optional value. So what happens if we call console.log, so we can see the output value, and we call sayHello with no arguments? Well, right now what we get an uncaught type error because we can't call length of undefined. And when we call sayHello with no name value, name will be undefined, and on line 9, we return name.length. which means that we throw an error. But for me, say hello doesn't make sense without the name, so I'm going to change my function to require it to actually do anything. So what I'm going to do here is we'll do a similar thing. If type of our name is undefined, then what are we going to do? Well, we don't want to set a default value because I've defined that say hello needs a name. So if we have a name, we'll just return 0. Now what we have here is an optional return. This value on line 5 will only get called if name is undefined. And since return is called on line 5, in that case, lines 6, 7, 8, 9, and the rest are not called, meaning we shouldn't see a console.log or the return of name.length, meaning we should avoid the error and get a much more predictable output. So if we take a look, we see our greetings world for James, and it returns 5, because 5 is the number of letters in James. Then we see hello world Jim, which is returning 3 for Jim. And then this last console.log output is 0, because that is what we returned in the case of name being undefined, which is our last call. If we remove the 0 here and just call return, we'll remember that that returns the undefined value. So if we refresh, we now have undefined. So if we don't pass anything in, undefined is what it'll return. And if we do pass it in, that will be the return value, or what the expression of calling our function will evaluate to. So this is the basic idea of a function. It takes an input, it performs an action, and it returns an output. Our different functions may rely on different parts of those three options in different capacities. Some functions may take in properties and not return anything meaningful. Some functions may not take any arguments and return something. And some functions will be some mix of those. So we have our inputs, outputs, and what we call side effects, like calling console.log. It's neither an input or an output, but it's something that is triggered by calling our function. So we can have a function that takes no arguments and returns no value, but still is useful because it performs some action. So now we've seen how arguments and return values work in functions. There's also another key feature called scopes, which we'll explore in the next video.